What's up everyone, Deejus here. So, after receiving many requests, I finally decided to make an instructional video series on some concrete and somewhat simple steps to improve your Advance Wars gameplay. So for these tips, it really doesn't matter if you're playing Advance Wars by web, or you're preparing to beat some friends in the new Reboot Camp game, or you just want to beat your grandma your old Game Boy Advance cartridge. These tips will help you improve your game regardless of the console. To be fair, my only experience playing Advance Wars before joining Advance Wars by web 6 months ago was playing campaign mode and War Room and Dual Strike and Advance Wars 2 using these strategies. So if I can make the transition from campaign mode to competitive in this short period of time, so can you. So this video is going to examine tips to help higher level beginners become intermediate players, or in Advance Wars by web, attaining the coveted 1000 ranking. Contrary to popular belief, when I started playing Advance Wars by web, I didn't suddenly go to 1400 or 1300 or even 1200 for that matter. I made it to 1000 using these fundamentals and nothing else. I didn't even know the tiers. I flailed around a bit, then it went up to 1100, flailed around, etc. before using what I learned from those losses and flailing to propel myself further. So this video will help you overcome those same struggles that I faced, hopefully without you taking all of the losses that I did in the process. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into those tips.
Tip number 1, CO selection.
Look, I already made a detailed video series about choosing COs depending on the map, so I won't go into it here. I'll just leave a link to the series. #plug. It's an incredible resource, and I wish I had it when I first started playing Advance Wars by web. If you are a classic Advance Wars player and you don't know the Advance Wars by web tiers, just take a peek at the COs on the thumbnail to know which one I'm discussing in each video. Because picking a proper CO can give you a massive boost to your game, and shift your rating anywhere from 50 to 100 points depending on CO matchups. So choosing a proper CO for the map is essential.
Tip number 2, limit base skipping.
Look, let me break this down simple for y'all. Limit base skipping. For those of you who don't know what base skipping is, it's when you don't produce a unit on a base for a turn. This can be because you couldn't afford a unit, or because you're planning to save up some cash for a more expensive unit a turn or so later. But the thing is, my rule of thumb is to never base skip if you have 2 bases or less, as your unit count will probably hover around 20-ish for the match, and every single unit will be significant. If there are 3 or more bases, I still avoid base skipping, but maybe I'll consider it once every 3 games or so. One time. And only in very niche situations. These situations are when the opponent has a unit that needs to be countered immediately. For example, this could take the form of you needing to build a fighter to counter an enemy stealth, or your opponent builds several neo tanks or medium tanks in range of your airport and you want to create a bomber. Like I said, very niche situations. In the vast majority of games, you do not want to base skip because unit count is one of the most important indicators of who's winning the game.
Tip number 3, unit overlap.
Okay, so this is probably the most important tip. Unit overlap. This is probably 50% plus of what it takes to get to 1000 ranking or just improving your skills dramatically. Your units need to be actively defending your other units. If your units are not adequately defended, a skilled opponent will easily take advantage of your weakness. You need to have proper positioning and coverage so it can serve as a deterrent for your enemy to attack you, and it can also come into play in the offensive as well. No cover means your units can be vulnerable to trapping as well, and I'll show another example of that. So let's look into it in detail. Okay, here's an example where units are not properly covering each other. In this instance, you were the green player, and you made a very strange decision to attack a random infantry unit off on the side rather than covering your tank brethren. As you can see, the bottom left green tank is 7 spaces away from the nearest tank, so it does not have any coverage of that tank. This misstep allows the pink player to get some nice clean hits off on those undefended green tanks on the right, and some nice trades in the meantime. Whereas that one green tank on the side is virtually useless this turn. As you can see, this turn was incredibly favorable for the pink player. I would like to add that all these attacks were with average luck rolls, so this would be the average outcome for most of these engagements. This time though, we're not playing around. We have adequate backup. Let's see how the pink tanks fared this time. They get a nice attack off, but now we have some nice efficient counterattacks. And if you count up the unit value right now, we are actually winning even though they had first strike advantage. One of my favorite coverage techniques, especially in standard play, is the elastic band technique. It covers up a lot of ground, and although it seems your tanks are thin at some points, watch what happens when Pink tries to get a numbers advantage in the middle. Let's get 'em, boys. Yeah, looking time to resign for good old Pinky over here. Another popular coverage strategy, particularly in Fog, is the death ball strategy. This basically means shoving all your units into one big ball, usually in the middle, so they all cover one another. Therefore, if the opponent attacks one of the units, all of them can attack in response. It's a nice big way to deter your opponent from attacking your units. More simple than the band strategy, but it lacks the same degree of map coverage. Another consequence of not properly covering units is unit trapping. In this instance, the medium tank says, "Oh look, a nice free hit on this tank over here." Unfortunately for it though, since it has no coverage from those two tanks in the bottom left, it is very vulnerable to trapping, and now this artillery will get a nice shot off on it. This is a very simplified example, but unit trapping is a real threat.
Tip number 4, strong sides and weak sides.
Differentiating strong sides and weak sides is an important part of competitive Advance Wars, particularly in Fog. Bottom line, in Advance Wars, you cannot expect to win all fronts versus a competent opponent. You will have to take losses. But what you want to do is pick a side as your strong side, send most of your units there, and try to maximize your gains on your strong side, while limiting your losses on your weak side. By keeping a strong side with many units, you can keep one of your fronts dynamic and completely overrun an opponent who might have two evenly split fronts. More units means you can do more damage, outposition your opponent more, trap units more, have better counterattacks, and it opens up many other opportunities that aren't typically available on even fronts. Think about it. If you attack your opponent's army 10 times, it'll be able to do a lot less to you than if you only attacked it 5 times. Basic math. Think of it like this. Basically, you want to have infantry and a skeleton crew on your weak side, and your goal is to make them use their more powerful units to waste their time killing infantry, while your strong units are smashing tanks. After all, medium tanks are meant to counter tanks, not kill infantry. Sometimes maps will automatically choose which side is your strong side and which side is your weak side by virtue of giving you or your opponent more bases on one side of the map. I mean, you could try putting an equal amount of incoming units on both sides, but a competent opponent will likely take advantage of this and hammer one side, while your other side won't really make up enough ground versus their weak side. That, and if you do put both equal income, they usually result in stally, boring long games, and nobody likes that. It's worth noting that some maps have 2, 3, or even 4 fronts, depending on how large the map is and how many bases and natural blocking features, like mountains, there are. I typically go to win 1 of 2 fronts, or try to win 2 of 3 fronts, or 2 of 4 fronts. You don't want to split yourself out too thin. Typically the middle is the front most worth winning, as it usually has a good number of bases and increases the maneuverability of your units considerably, as they can shift from side to side more easily with access to the middle. However, there are certain maps where foregoing the middle to focus on the sides is actually better. Strong sides and weak sides are by no means permanent, and there is a caveat that you can switch your strong side mid-game, but this is a higher level tactic that I'll break down in a future video for more intermediate and higher advanced players. For now, make sure at the beginning of the game you decide which is your strong front and which is your weak front.
Tip number 5, healing units.
Look, healing units in Advance Wars is a crucial and often overlooked part of the game. Since you're limited for most maps to producing 2 to 3 units, healing a unit instead of losing it can be huge and totally worth the investment. Staying ahead on unit count is one of the best indicators to who is winning the game. More units means your turns are more dynamic, and your opponent needs to account for more threats. I would take unit advantage over income advantage in the vast majority of scenarios. This is particularly true with infantry. Although they cost only 1k funds, they remain crucial throughout the entire game. Many times, I've seen opponents successfully win major battles, but they are completely unable to capitalize and take over contested properties because they lost too many infantry or they didn't heal them sufficiently. So keeping infantry and other units healed is incredibly useful.
Tip number 6, using anti-air correctly.
If you've watched any of my videos, you probably know this is one of my biggest pet peeves with Advance Wars players. Anti-air usage can be a huge part of winning a close match, and oftentimes I see people lose to battlecopters despite creating the appropriate number of anti-air. The reason why? They were way too reckless with their anti-airs. Alright, the general rule of thumb in Advance Wars is that anti-air are made to combat air units, not infantry. Your anti-air should remain behind your front lines and protect your tanks and other units from battlecopters and bombers, making sure their movement overlaps with the units you want to protect. If you put your anti-air on the front lines, your opponent will target it and kill it, allowing free reign for their air units unless you invest in 2 anti-air, which isn't cheap. When I face less experienced opponents, I love to keep my battlecopters hidden for a little bit until the opponent gets impatient and then just reveals their anti-air and attacks like an infantry or something. Then I kill the anti-air, reveal my battlecopter when they can't counter it. Super easy tactic, but a surprising amount of Advance Wars players don't really follow this basic concept, so appropriately using your anti-air correctly can significantly boost you in rating. Also, you don't want to overdo anti-air. Typically, you only need, my rule of thumb is 1 anti-air per 1.5 copters. So if there are 3 copters, I typically make 2 anti-air, or even better, I also like using B-copters as a counter to anti-air, so maybe I make 1 anti-air and 1 B-copter to counter 2 or 3 copters.
Tip number 7, overextension.
Alright, even the best of us are guilty of this one. You're winning the important battles. You're heading the capture game and you keep pushing, just pushing further into your opponent's territory until you realize your opponent has more units than you, beats you back, and then turns the tide of the battle and suddenly you're losing. This is often the result of overextending. Because you push too far into your opponent's territory, they can reinforce their units way faster than you can reinforce your army, leading to a unit advantage. My general rule of thumb is that you don't want to be fighting battles that is twice as far from your bases as it is from your opponent's base. There's also no shame in counting the spaces from bases to bases if you're unsure where the point is on the map. Another thing, if you're winning the capture game, you dictate the game. Chill. You have the lead. You probably maintain it. Let them come to you. The longer they have less funds, the better for you. There is a caveat that if you're facing certain COs like Eagle, you may want to press a little bit harder, but for the vast majority of, opponents, just chill, man. Enjoy your lead. You don't want to press it and ruin it. Well, that's all the tips that you should need to reach 1,000 on Advance Wars by web or beat the average grandma on Advance Wars 2 game cartridge. So, stay tuned for part 2 where we examine some more complex topics to bring you from intermediate to upper intermediate. Have a good one. Bye.